Welcome. In this course, we are looking at the System Security Certified Practitioner, also known as SSCP. This lecture is based off of the book System Security Certified Practitioner, the Official Study Guide, 2nd edition. ISBN 978-111-9542940. A lot of the graphics and content in these video lectures are all taken out of this book. I'm assuming that you have this book. These video lectures are just to kind of reinforce concepts discussed within this book. Alrighty, so lesson 10 is about incident response and recovery. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at Domain 3, risk identification, monitoring, and analysis. Domain 4, incident response and discovery. That includes things like business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning and activities. I will also talk about incident lifecycle and the forensics process as it relates to incident response. Alright, so the first section is about defeating the kill chain one skirmish at a chance. So essentially, we need to understand some language before we get too far into this. So one of the big ones is APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, which poses a potential for the most damaging attack to the infrastructure, system, and so much more. APTs must, out of necessity, use a robust kill chain to discover, reconnaissance, characterize, infiltrate, gain access, and target their victims. Essentially, what happens is these advanced persistent threats are there. They're threats that we have to handle. So it's often been said that there is several attackers. If we have a defender, let's say a security professional for an organization, the security for the organization has to be correct and protect 100% of the time. An attacker just has to be once. They just got to get lucky just one time. So let's say we have our organization and we have our defender. They're going to be bombarded with attacks. If one gains access, it's game over. So the defender has to be correct 100% of the time. The attacker just has to be right once. So there is good news though. There are structures and there's risk management and mitigation techniques and strategies that help reduce the likelihood of an event occurring. Hopefully by now, the organization should be prepared to respond for an issue that actually arises. So again, the goal here is to make it harder for the attacker to gain access. Hopefully, at that point, they don't want to keep wasting their time. Yes, eventually they could get in, but it's a risk versus reward. If you make it a little harder than your competition for them to break into you, guess what? The attacker might go after your competition instead of you because you are the little harder of a target. Now, if you have two organizations and the reward is the same, but one's harder to get into than the other, oftentimes the attackers are going to go for the lowest hanging fruit. So when we bring up things like APT directly, essentially the goal is to understand that you're probably not going to be interacting with the APT directly. You're going to be finding ways for you to find the threats. That way, wherever he is hiding, or wherever they are hiding, you can kick them out of your systems. Normally we design to defeat a particular APT and to thwart their ability to do whatever they're trying to do, but that gets very intensive, that gets very cost intensive, and all around it's just not always the easiest way. APT has a large arsenal of weaponry, and again, their entire purpose is to try to gain access to your systems. So why should the SSCP put so much emphasis on APT? and their use of kill chain, because virtually every major data breach in the past has a very specific pattern. It's very low, very slow, very sequential, and it's a process that we can actually identify. The kill chain is the pattern. So note that if any of those low and slow attack steps have been thwarted earlier in the process, the breach may not have occurred. Or if any of those earlier reconnaissance efforts were again prevented, the attacker may give up. So preparation and planning are the key to survival when we are looking at how to protect our organization. So what does that mean? That means we need to understand the kill chain basics. So if you've been following along with the different lessons in our Lesson 1, we looked at the value chain, which is the model for how an organization creates value in products or services. Well, again, that's a pattern. There's a structure. A key input could be a delaying or failing to meet a requirement for quality or quantity, so skilled labor might not be available when we need it. So there's different components here that might stop the value chain from meeting its thresholds. Well, kill chain is very similar. Kill chain comes from the military operations planning, which after all is the business of killing the opponent's ability, its forces, or breaking their systems. So kill chains are outcome-based planning concepts that are geared towards achieving the national strategic, operational, and technical outcomes as part of a larger battle. These kill chains tend to be planned from a desired outcome back towards starting a set of inputs. So what are the starting points that we can see in informational systems kill chain? Again, this is the total sets of actions, plans, tasks, and resources used by a APT. So the overall structure is to 1. Identify potential target information systems that suit the APT's objective. 2. Gain access to those targets and establish command and control, or CNC, over portions of those target systems. 3. Use that CNC to carry out further tasks in supporting of achievement of their objectives. So how do APTs apply the kill chain in practice? In very broad terms, it could be like surveying the marketplace for potential opportunities for the outcomes, gathering intelligence data about potential targets, conducting the initial intrusion or selected targets for a specific system, establish some form of CNC pressure, conduct further reconnaissance, begin exploitation of a selected asset, complete exploitation activities, obfuscate or destroy evidence, or disconnect from a target system. The more complex systems, essentially the more complex, will use multiple layers, multiple targets, multiple proxies, multiple ways to hide their kill chain processes. So using one target system to become a platform to launch their attacks. So the goal may be to infect one computer and pivot from that one computer to other computers on the corporate network. So avoiding the stereotypical APTs, because APTs can be almost any kind of organized efforts to achieve a set of goals. The value might come from information that they're accessing, or what they can get from you, what they can steal from you, information that you may have that they can then exploit for other targets. So APTs have been seen as part of campaigns waged against organizations by organized crime, terrorist groups, governments, private businesses, espionage, so forth. The APT threat actor, or the people whom they work with or for, have motives that range from maybe ideology, mercenary, power, revenge. They're being paid for it. They want the thrill. Lots of different reasons. APT threat actors and campaigns that have attempts to run may be most of any size, scale, or complexity. So be mindful. If you understand the patterns, you may be dealing with an individual, or you may be dealing with a team of individuals. So it really just depends. So that means we're going to be on the lookout for a incident or event. So what does that mean? An incident or event are a very specific action item. Alright, so back in our lesson 2, our security fundamentals, we define an event of interest as something that happens that might be an indicator of something that might impact your informational system security. So we could also talk about, so here we talked keyword event of interest, an indicator. We could also have an indicator of compromise, or IOC. If we happen to see logs of fictitious traffic from leaving a system, that would be an indicator that that system may be infected. So let's suppose for a moment that you have a company and its IT systems have caught the attention of a threat actor, or APT. How might their attention show up as observable activities? Well, it could be network scanning, could be various anomalies, it could be phishing emails, it could be a mini level of different attacks or even probes based off of their experience and their level, which may be completely unrelated to one another, but these are all anomalies that might add up to something more. That's why the ability to understand the pattern is really important. So what is a security incident? Several definitions by NIST or ITIL or the IEFT all suggest that computer security incidents are events involving a target information system in a way that are, again, I'm going to write these out because this is a big one for the exam. So a incident are an event involving planning that are disruptive, that are hostile or harmful, might compromise the CIA, that is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And lastly, willful violate the policies for acceptable use, security, or access. So, violation of policies such as acceptable use policy. So that is normally how we identify a security incident. So again, they're unplanned. They might be more. Oh, I said planned. That was a misstep. That was unplanned. So, unplanned could be a shutdown of an email server. Actually, I take that back. So, this is a planned part from the attacker's perspective. That is unplanned activities from the organization. From the attacker's perspective, they want to stop email flow. So the unplanned activity would be the stopping of mail flow from the organizational perspective. Them having control of the ability to shut down an email server could be the incident. So you may have to investigate what's going on, rule out natural causes, accidental causes. So you'll have to find what's going on. You'll also typically do a vulnerability assessment that might discover what's going on or find ways to actually seeing some clarity. meaning you might, after the email server is shut down, you bring it online, it shuts down again, you bring it back online, you may do a vulnerability assessment and see, oh, that email server's out of date. Or you may do some incident response work, and you may see the logs show a shutdown command by a user who doesn't work here or who's unauthorized. So again, part of this is investigating what's going on. The incident is a planned attack from the attacker's perspective that leads to unplanned events from the organization. They're disruptive, harmful. They are possibly dealing with the CIA, confidentiality, I for integrity, A for availability, and it will violate some form of policies such as the acceptable use policy. So when we're doing this, consider the challenges or differentiating phishing attacks from innocent-based requests. A phishing attempt could be one of the first steps in a larger scale attack. So is this an event or is this an incident? So we do have to keep that in mind. So we defined incident. A event is simply just something that happens or occurs that's important. So an event of interest could be an accident, could be a system failure, could be natural causes. There's recovery processes for all of these. Natural causes, we should have a business continuity plan. Accidental issues, we should have procedures for safety and training. System failure should be maintenance. For intrusion or unauthorized access or malware, we should have security planning or a security incident structure. So note that our role as a SSCP does require us to view these incidences from the overall information risk management and mitigation perspective, as well as from the information system security perspective, and it's quite likely that the computer security perspective is the more challenging one, demanding a much deeper and greater degree of rapid-fire analysis as well as decision making. So we'll focus on those as we go through the rest of the chapter. Alright, so let's go on to the next section, which would be Incident Response Framework. Now that we understand what APTs are, now we have to figure out how to counter them. So first of all organizations, regardless of size, should have some type of process or framework to handle when an incident occurs. According to NIST, the 861R2 will add the initial preparation phase and flow. So, are there multiple variations of this incident response? Answer is yes. There isn't a single structure, but there are multiple ways that have some common structures to it. So the normal phases are detection, response, mitigation, reporting, recovery, remediation. Remediation does mean we may have to loop back to response and go through this cycle a few times. And then at the end, we have lessons learned. So again, detect, response, mitigation, reporting, recovery, remediation, and lessons learned. And this is the same general structure that the NIST 861 incident response flow covers. So these are more specific frameworks as a formalized process that is outlined on how to react when something occurs. An important point to bring up is that all other publications and authorities such as ITIL or ISO may have their own slightly different variations, but most of them have the same general structure. That's one. Two, don't ever think about counter-attacking. Your organization, if you have a plan, are strictly limited by laws, regulations, and ethics. If you know who attacked you, you cannot attack them. The actual attack process is the illegal component that, well, gets people in trouble. So again, you need to not attack if you know who's responsible. No counterattack. So that brings us up to our incident response teams, roles, and structures. So unless you're a very small organization, you're going to have some type of group. Network administrators, system administrators, security, incident response. You'll have to have a formally designated team who is, responsible for dealing with incident response. This team might be called CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team, CER. CERT can also be known as the Computer Incident Response Team, or Incident Response for Cyber Activities, or Cyber Incident Response Team, CERT, CIRT, or the Computer Security Incident Response Team, CSIRT. For ease of reference, we're going to call all of these CSIRT, Computer Security Incident Response Team. So understand that CERT or CSRIT, these are just the teams and structures for the individuals focusing on responding to an incident. Your organization risk appetite and its specific CIA-NA should determine whether the CSIRT provides around the clock, on-site, partially. Do they contract this out? Do they have their own NOC or SOC? What is the funding looking like? So these kind of all depend on the risk appetite of your organization. When we are dealing with this, do we have a single point of failure for an incident response? Do we have a team of 1? Do we have a team of 5? Is our team 5 able to handle round the clock? Is it Monday through Friday, 8 to 5? Is it limited? So there's things that we have to consider. Focus reporting, coordinating responses, escalating, and coordinating are all part of that single point of failure portion. What happens is you need to take control of an incident. Do we have a formalized process so that help desk doesn't just fix the machine? We need a process so that we know how to recover. We also need a process so that if help desk reimages the machine, do we lose all the evidence? And sometimes the answer is yes. So that process should be in place to prevent the loss of said information. Investigate, analyze, and assess the incident. Part of our process. Escalate, report, and engage with the appropriate leadership components. Keep running incident logs. Keep a record of everything. Coordinate when appropriate to third parties. Might be alarm companies, could be your vendors. It really just depends what is based off of your organization. Maybe you have a cloud provider, email provider, lots of different ones. Before you share incident information, make sure you have buy-in from the appropriate leadership. Also, make sure you have policies and procedures for reporting and working with third parties or anyone that you're going to be sharing that information with. Because all of those play a huge role in possible contamination or possible data leakage because you share too much information with a third party. So have policies and procedures before you do so. Make sure you also have signage, maybe general counsel signs off. Have that process to cover your butt. Understand your response. Understand how to contain an incident if there is an incident. Eradicate an incident. So after we contained, after we verified, how do we ensure we've removed the incident? If it's malware, how are we certain? What are our measurements? What are our metrics for verification? You need to be able to recover from the incident, but ensure a certain level of protection. Lastly, document lessons learned. Capture everything possible regarding the deficiencies, vulnerabilities, procedures figure out how they got in, how you can actually improve your protection. Always do what you've learned. That way you can grow. There are priorities when dealing with an incident. The last priority is that lessons learned. So you do need to keep that in mind. Lessons learned is actually very important. So let's talk about priorities. All right, so again, doesn't matter how your organization breaks up the response management, it's always going to be a very specific sequence of steps. Those steps are always going to be assigned to different individuals or teams within the organization. The incident response team has to keep 3 basic priorities firmly in mind. The first one is very easy. The safety of people come first. You set a fire policy, for example. If the fire system detects a fire in the building, all the doors open. That is because it's following that key principle. People come first. The next 2 priority choices, well, that takes a little bit more effort. So they're actually one of the most difficult decisions facing organizations within that process. And relatively straightforward. It could be as simple as, should it prioritize getting back into the normal business operations or supporting a digital forensics investigation? They may establish the responsibilities of guilt, liability of the incident, but result in loss and damages. So this is not a decision that on-the-scene response leaders make. This is something that you need to have ahead of time. The example I gave earlier, if help desk puts up a system that was infected, that destroys all the digital forensics evidence. So are we focused on recovery or figuring out what happened, or some type of hybrid of both of them? And again, that's not as easy to review for organizations, but it's something that has to be set up well above a incident. So it's always a funny debate, like which is the most important part, and it really depends on the individual organization, their structure, their status, their leadership. Even some local and state and federal government agencies struggle with this. What is the best approach? Sometimes getting back operational is more important than figuring out what happened. But sometimes figuring out what happened is more important. So it really depends on the circumstances and the leadership of the organization. The details of how to preserve an incident scene or digital forensics investigation and how much the investigations should be conducted is beyond the scope of this exam. But that's an entirely different specialty. So when we are talking about digital forensics, again, that's a whole nother set of security. But that does lead into a very common thread, and that is you need to be prepared. Preparedness or preparation is king when it comes to being able to be ready for an incident. So preparation, we've noticed this step isn't shown in the figures in our chapters. That's not an oversight. This should be done as soon as you start the process. There's nothing to gain by waiting. So this is a huge part here, is understanding that you do a plan to do checklist, for example. Step 1 is the preparation. You cannot do it too soon. So again, potentially everything to lose if you wait. So the NIST SP 861 provides an excellent shopping list for key preparation and planning tasks that you can do for your plan to do checklist. So let's talk about the preparation planning checklist. So the first set of tasks focus on gathering what the organization already knows about everything, about their assets, about their inventory, about their information systems, about their infrastructure, business processes, key personnel, foundation, missions, objectives, all of that. You'll notice inventory was in there. Actually, that's one of the key things that organizations know but like to forget about, and that is ensuring proper inventory and inventory management. Because if you don't know what you have, you don't know how to protect against it. So as a living library, you need to develop your assets. Information architect, the documentation, security documentation, backup images and backup procedures and recovery processes, the network and communications designs, installation documentation, our logical flow or our physical topology flow for data communications, our platform and service system documentations, the physical layout diagrams, power consumption information, status of known vulnerabilities, and remediation steps, contact information for key staff members like a directory service. All of that is there. So part of that means we have to have a very specific set of rules. So use the list to identify the business processes, system architect, and technology-focused critical knowledge that the CSERT team will be aware of. That includes things like assemble critical data collection of data and information and analysis-based tools, characterizing an event in real time, quickly determining the nature of the urgency of the response that it will demand, and then being able to respond appropriately. You can only do that if you have the critical data collection and the correlation of the information so you can analyze it correctly. Establish minimum standards of event logging. What are the minimum requirements for your logging? Don't say log everything. Don't say log anything. Look at what are the minimal standards that are necessary to stay compliant within your organization and the rules set forth. You may also have an organizational structure that says, or a compliance requirement or regulation requirement that says, for your organization type, you have to log X. So be mindful of that. Identify forensics requirements, capabilities, and relationships. Does your CSERT team know how to do certain things? Are they expected to do certain things? Are the requirements of your CSERT, your response team, how far into the digital forensics process should they go? So again, all of that means taking the time to develop these processes. By the end of this preparation planning, you should have some concrete ideas about your CERT team. Do you have a NOC? Do you have a SOC? Does your organization need the real-time component? Or are they okay 12 hours a day, or 8 to 5, or 8 hours a day, or what hours? All of those are questions that can then quickly be answered after you have that information. The physical workspace, responders' ability to work. If there's an incident, well, what workspace are you using? What is the process? Is there a location? Reporting, escalation, incident management, chain of command, and procedures. That's another one. If there's an incident and management says, yes, this is an incident, what's the response? Who's in charge? What do you do? How do you do it? There needs to be a formalized process for you to go through. And oftentimes, the first times that you implement these, they suck. So what do? You go through them a second time. Actually, I'm going to grab my pen. So the first loop is going to suck. Well, you go through it again and you get better. You still suck, but it's better. You go through it a third time, and again, you suck a little less, but it's better. And your goal is you keep going through until you actually have a certain level of mastery of your plan. Not just that, each iteration of your plan, you're going to notice failures of areas that you may not have considered or thought about. So what ends up happening is each time you go through the mock process, hopefully they're mock processes and not, regular attacks, but each time that you go through the process, you learn more, you can do better, and next time, you can refine your plan. So a perfect example for this. I live in Las Vegas, and we had an active shooter a number of years ago. Before the active shooter actually happened, we had our hospital system go through a mock review. This was about 9 months prior to the active shooter. Well, the first run through, our medical system did a very bad job. The mock run through was an active shooter in a open air event. And the system they didn't know how to respond. They didn't know how to triage. They didn't have a good process. So they mock killed a bunch of people. Well, they took what they learned and they did it again a few months later. That time, they actually had a much better understanding of the process, and so they killed, again, mock, less people. So the night of the actual active shooter, what ended up happening was the medical system was ready. They were prepared. They had a plan. They had actually ran through several mock scenarios, and they had actually homed their processes, meaning when the first ambulance arrived and the details of what was going on happened, the plan kicked in. And everyone knew their role. Everyone knew their process. Everyone knew their guidelines. So the doctors that were doing triage, that's what they did. They did triage. But the doctors that were doing the triage knew the process. They had the color tags. They knew what to do. What ended up happening that night, because that hospital system was prepared, they saved more lives because they had actually homed their plan. This can be applied to just any type of scenario. When you're dealing with a ransomware attack, it could be how you respond plays a key role in how the situation plays out. If you plan, if you run through scenarios, you go through mock examples, you fix the areas that you've identified as gaps, and you go through it again, and you find more gaps, and you fix them, and you go through it again, and again, and again, until your plan is good. You can save lives. You can decrease the potential damage of an attack. And this only goes to strengthen your ability to recover from an event. And hopefully those type of events don't happen, but in the world we live in, we need to be prepared for the events that are occurring. So, now that we talked about preparing a plan, let's talk about putting our plan in action. Sorry about that, it clicked too many times. So put the plan in motion. This is where the doing part of your checklist begins. Some of the actions you'll take are strictly internal, may be very technical. Some might be improvement, some might be administrative controls. It really just depends. The checklist could be as simple as, are the clocks, are the timing of your devices all synchronized? Are there profiles on your computers? Are the profiles backed up? Are the computers backed up? Are the servers backed up? Are there established channels for communicating with third-party vendors if there's an issue? You want to establish some type of incident response as it relates to how you connect with external entities in that relationship. Develop the procedures for your incident response. If an incident response is occurring, who declares it? Is there a person that has to say, yes, this is an incident, and that kicks off the plan? If not, then what are the thresholds for developing your plan? Initiate training and certification as required. Again, you want to be proficient, you want to have a certain level of skill, so you want to be able to organize and plan accordingly, and that means go through some training. At the end of all of this, the question you have to ask yourself is, are you prepared? And the prepared planning is kind of important. So maybe you're actually prepared. Maybe you have a ready to respond and you're good. Maybe you're not just ready for an incident at all. Maybe you've able to achieve a certain level of verified knowledge and procedures and guidelines, and you have people that are trained. Your organization's missions, goals, objectives, strategies, posture will actually determine if you are ready. So while at it, don't forget you do need to have some normal business understanding. You could be 100% secure, but if you're not meeting your business objectives, are you actually ready? And so there has to be a certain level of alignment that oftentimes is forgot about. So some of the automated and semi-automated tools that you might be using might be a SIM, Security Incident Event Management based system, and that will help to centralize logs and analyze data. We also have a intrusion detection system that's passively looking at traffic. It may see something, so it might email you, but it won't actively engage a threat, while an intrusion prevention system is active. If it sees something, it can do something, as well as other monitoring and logging based tools or channels. All of those readiness components are there. So understand your business normal from a IT system perspective, meaning what does your organization understand its normal data flow? Is there a way to identify normal? What are the baselines? Routinely demonstrate and test backups. My favorite is I just had a client. They were using the backup features of a virtualization platform, supposed to be the best in the market. They had a server failure, and they used this cloud-based backup to recover, which they've never done before. Well, they didn't realize the recovery process for a single VM may have been a 14-day recovery process. Well, that was their backup solution because they've never bothered to test it, so that's what they were stuck with. 10 days into the recovery process, the recovery server restarted. They had to start all over again, 14 more days. Turns out, it actually was faster to rebuild the system than it was to do a recovery. You have to test your backup procedures. Test and recover. That way you know what the shortcomings are. And if the 14-day was acceptable, are you able to go down that line? And sometimes the answer is no. Exercise your alerts, recall, notification, escalation, reporting processes. Test them. Make sure they work. Make sure they're actually doing the guidelines that your process is set to develop. Are you able to test and escalate appropriately? Are the escalations occurring correctly? Document your incident. Document your response. Document your procedures. Use these documents as part of your training and readiness procedure guidelines. Again, you need to know what your processes are, but you should document them and use them. That way, in your mock run-throughs, they can treat it like a real event. That way, they can be better prepared. So when we said your checklist for target readiness, that could be determine an incident has occurred, who initiates it, analyze the precursors and indicators, look for the appropriate corrective actions, perform searching, prioritize handling of an incident over relevant factors. So again, if a server goes down, are we interested in recovery or are we interested in the incident? You need to have that all ahead of time. But all of those go back in the detection and analysis phase. In the next phase, containment, eradication, and recovery, you can look at acquiring and preserving evidence, containing the incident, eradicating the incident, identify and mitigating all of the vulnerabilities that were exploited as part of the incident, remove the malware, and appropriately review the process. If more infected hosts are discovered, again, expand and eradicate on all systems. Recover from the overall incident. Return affected systems back to a normal operating state. And grow. After that, we have our post-incident activities. Create a follow-up report. Verify your follow-up report. hold lessons learned meetings to grow from the incident. Taken all at once, this looks like a lot of preparation, yet much of what you needed to do by your incident response team, they need to be there. If they're going to be well prepared, it comes right from the actual design of the assessments, your vulnerability assessments, your risk mitigation implementation activities, and other key pieces of information. All of this overall approach comes by managing and maintaining the control over your information systems and IT infrastructure. And you should already be carrying out the basic hygiene of your IT-based systems and safety and security measures that are already part of your plan that's already in place, logging, testing, and so forth. So the additional effort should be fairly minimal, but you actually have to do it. And that's the key area that a lot of organizations aren't doing. So that leads us into our next area of detection and analysis. So the three factors combine to make the art and science difficult and challenging. So the main areas here are going to be things like multiple different means of detection, incredible high volumes of events that might occur, and a deep specialist knowledge along the considerable experience that's required. So when we're looking at an attack, the attack can be detected a number of ways, but can also be masked a number of ways. Also, you can overload information and then hide once information is flowing. You can also mask yourself and look like normal traffic. And again, a lot of these are specialty type items. So how does your response team sort through the noise to find what's really going on? And part of that is going to be warning signs. Warning signs are a precursor or of a sign, essentially a signal, some type of observable characteristic of an occurrence. Itself is not the attack, but it's something that you can tell is leading up to. For example, when you are standing outside and you can smell the rain, but it's not raining yet, that's a precursor. You know it's going to happen, it just hasn't happened yet. So let's look at a few common examples illustrated by this. Server logs see a number of failed attempts from an external address. Well, if they've been regularly, eventually, if you're not doing something about it, they may get in. So if you see every Monday for the last, 6 months a potential attack, that could be a precursor of something larger. If you're getting emails or phone calls, could be a phishing campaign. All of those are precursors to a potential attack. Anonymous complaints is a big one. Increasingly hostile or angry content in social media posting about customer services or things like that. Negative, huge upkeep in your business. All of those could be warning signs of something going on. An indicator is a sign or signal or observable characteristic of an occurrence. So that normally means a occurrence of an event indicating something's happening. Network intrusion is generating alerts. Antivirus software detects something. A few unmanaged hosts or endpoints attempt to join the network. All of those are logged events that could be going on. One type of indicator worth special attention is called the indicator of compromise, IOC, which is an observable artifact with a high confidence of something going on. In one respect, the fact that detection is a war of numbers is both a blessing and a curse. In many cases, even the first few low and slow steps in an attack may create dozens or hundreds or thousands of indicators, each with a way of leading to an attack. So if you're lucky, might contain information about the attacker correlates them to a specific suspicious pattern. Of course, that's not always the case. You might have to assess and screen and filter and go through. So let's look at the initial detection. So the initial detection is the initial incident that comes from a process by a person normally finding what's going on. So it could be software based that then kicks it over to a human. It could be tools like a SIM that say, hey, look at this. It really just depends. But it does generate a hypothesis of saying, hey, something is not right. This initial detection is correlated and analyzed by a number of indicators and sometimes precursors. Usually, there's also a data aggregator of some sort that helps get you to that conclusion if something is happening. What we do is we find the hypothesis, we test the hypothesis against the indicators, and we see if there is something to be alarmed against. Ongoing analysis will gather more details, and then again, you may have to rinse and repeat a few times to see if there's actually an attack. Note the dilemma here. Paying too much attention too soon to too many alarms may distract the attention and divert resources. So you have to have a balance. And of course, if you've got your threshold set too high, you ignore alarms that might actually prevent an attack. So if you have your alarm set too low, you're alerting on everything, you spend too much time actually alerting and responding to those alerts, that could be nothing. You overwhelm your staff. Many of the headline-grabbing data breaches in the last several years, such as the targeted SOAR attack or things like that, actually have had a balance between the cost of dealing with too many false rejections. That's a type 1 error. So dealing with too many false rejections, type 1 error, and the risk of missing a few dangerous false acceptance, that is a type 2 error, set or wrong. So you want to have a nice balance between type 1 and type 2. Type 1, again, false rejections. Type 2 is false acceptance. So that kind of helps build a initial portion of detection of your timeline. So the next portion is, how do we actually build out a timeline from the initial detection, from the initial threat, as we grow forward? We have a timeline analysis. It may seem very obvious, but the timeline is probably one of the most analytical and powerful tools that is often overlooked. Timeline analysis reconstructs the sequence of events in order to help focus the analysis, raise the appropriate questions, generate insight, generate questions, and aid the organization in answering key pieces of information. Essentially, the timeline analysis should focus on asking, how did event A cause event B? Just asking the question may lead to some inference and some other components. So you can infer that event A actually caused other areas. With this kind of undiscovered event, you can start seeing approximate causes of other events. Making these educated guesses and making a note of them in your timeline analysis is a critical part in trying to figure out what happened. And without figuring what happened, your search for all of the elements that might have caused the incident to occur in the first place will be limited to lucky guesswork. So actually building out a timeline aids in the ability to make actual data-driven decision making. So after our timeline analysis, the next portion actually is about notification. So now that an incident response team has determined something has happened, how do we notify the appropriate individuals? The team must notify managers and leaders and maybe external vendors and so forth. So notification includes getting the appropriate authorities into the appropriate loop. This includes senior leadership and management that have to be notified as well. Again, this should all be handled ahead of time so that you have a proper procedure in place so you know what to do. If X happens, we do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that way, you don't have to worry about in the heat of the moment, oh, who should I call? You already know who to call. You have a process. And it says when an incident is occurring, you start with step A and you follow step A. And then when done with step A, you go to step B. And it could be, you initiate a phone calling tree. You call these 3 people and you instruct those 3 people to call 3 additional people. But again, you should have all of this ahead of time, and it should be documented and organized so that you can actually respond appropriately. An incident containment and eradication and recovery will continue with the CSERT, and they have to continue notifying responsibilities. Management may ask for their assistance or direct them to reach out directly to some content for updating or updates or help with help desk. So there needs to be a review process for notification. And that includes how to notify internal, external stakeholders. And you need to have the appropriate contacts to separate who needs to help and what they're going to be doing within that help structure. All of this goes back to being able to prioritize what are the steps. If we know an incident happens, we do A, B, C, D. Well, what section has the most priority? If we have get up equipment back up and working and we have a phone server and a web server and we don't have context, we may not know which device to get on first. If we know our business is related to phone directly and our website, well, it doesn't really generate money, we may not actually want to prioritize getting our website back up. We may want to prioritize getting our phone back up. So the notification portion directly ties to the prioritization of certain topics. So let's talk prioritization. There are several ways to prioritize the effort. Normally we look at functional impact, informational impact, and recoverability. But all of these have to take into account the strategy, business goals, and objectives of the organization. So for functional impact, we can look at natural disasters, we could look at malware, we could look at internal threats, but all of that's going to be back to how does that affect the business? How does that affect the business process? How does that affect the outcome of the business that are occurring? So the functional impact look at the processes and objectives. Information impact will consider whether the incident is high for unauthorized disclosure or corruption of data or deletion of data or leakage of data, but it's more informational. Recoverability involves whether or not you can actually recover and how quickly you can recover and what steps are having to be taken for recovery. One of the things that our book did not bring up is a business impact analysis. Let me grab my pen. Business impact analysis. So, when we're talking prioritization, the first step is to do a BIA. That will determine what assets are attached to which priorities, which assets are attached to which area, which areas are the most critical for the business, and it gives you a structure. That way, you know if A happens, you do A, B, C, D. If B happens, you do A, B, C, D. So it provides you the structure that is necessary to be able to respond. Business impact analysis, it is normally done in collaboration between business and IT to ensure a certain level of working together. That way, if something does happen, the IT group, the response team, the security group, or whoever is doing the recovery knows what to do. And all of the prioritization and the planning is all part of that BIA. So once we've prioritized, we can actually move on to the containment and eradication. So containment and eradication, these are two goals that are the next major sets of tasks. You can imagine the nature of a specific incident or an attack. You have to know how to eradicate and how to contain and how to recover. Containment is keeping everything together for that specific target. How do you contain the malware on two computers? Well, you can unplug the computers from network access. You have some ability to control a certain level of work. After that, there's an eradication process. That's identifying every instance of whatever is going on and then cleaning it up, removing it. So, our book does want us to cover a very specific component. A formal containment example is the process of identifying an affected or infected system element, hardware, software, communications, data, whatever, isolating them from the rest of the systems and or network to prevent the disruption causing agent and the disruption it is causing to affect other systems. Pay careful attention to the need to not only isolate the causing agent, but the malware on unauthorized user ID. So, if John's account installed malware on a computer, isolate the computer. But be mindful, John's account might be compromised because that's the account that installed the malware. So, you would have to work through the process of both identifying who and what systems. Typical containment tactics might include disconnecting the system, removing key portions of services, disconnecting it, full network access, disabling Wi-Fi, disabling outgoing connections, maybe turning on the firewall and blocking everything, disabling all the internal users and processes. It really just depends. A more familiar term is more of a quarantine. In general, your containment is a quarantine. You quarantine the suspect elements so that you can see what's happening. This gives us another term worthy of the definition, a casual agent. This is a software process or object or hardware element or performance procedure that performs the action on a targeted system that constitutes an incident, attack, or disruption. Malware payloads, they control parameter files or things like that, are examples of a casual agent. Bogus user IDs or sniffers or things like that that have already been stubborn by an attack could also be casual agents. So as you might suspect, the more sophisticated APT kill chains you have, they may use multiple methods to get into the system, so it makes eradication and containment a little harder. Eradication is the process of identifying every instance of the casual agent and its associated files and getting rid of them. Eradication should result in the formal declaration that the system, the segment, whatever, is now free. It's been verified and all remnants of the casual agent are gone. This declaration is the signal that the recovery of the element has begun. So, it's beyond the scope of the SSCP exam to get into many different techniques for incident response teams. We're keeping this very high level so that you understand that there is a process and that's kind of it. But there is a structure for gathering information and things of that nature. So part of that is, again, that evidence gathering, preservation, and use. So during all the stages of incident response, responders need to be able to gather information. The status, the state, the health, the logs, all of that is critical for the user or the responder to be able to grab from that user data. They need to be able to correlate the event logs from all the different elements and to determine a timeline. There is a real danger that an incident response team can spread itself too thin if the same group of people are containing and eradicating the threats. Understanding that organizations that are too small, that might just be the case, but the goal is to have the appropriate amount of team members so that you're not all spread too thin. As in all things, a balance is necessary. One of the big takeaways from the ability to gather evidence is also the ability to monitor. When we're dealing with monitoring, it comes to that first moment of the responder believing something has occurred. You need to be able to see what's going on. You need to be able to review monitoring logs. You need to be able to watch the infrastructure. You need to be able to see the resources of a system in real time. You need the training and expertise and experience in the tools that your company has to see what's happening. Do you see an increase in resources for a targeted system? Did a system go to 100%? So actually, I had a remote monitoring and management tool where I kept seeing a specific device every night pegging at 100% processing power. After the third night, something was up. I had to report it to the appropriate parties, and they did nothing about it. I did what I was supposed to do per my contract, but I also made sure to notify the correct party. What happened was the correct party wasn't trained in understanding what that meant. After several weeks, turns out that machine was infected with malware, and it was actually exfiltrating data back to an attacker. When I was called out on it, I was able to provide the documentation showing I alerted the appropriate person within an appropriate amount of time, but they failed to act because they didn't understand what was going on. So the constant monitoring portion is important, but understanding how to use the tools that you have are also important. You need to understand before you can take it, you understand what's happening. In incident response teams, it's first and foremost supposed to be manage their response to an incident. Without well-informed predictions of a result or a selected action, the team cannot manage. Not every event is worth experimenting on, which is how we test such predictions as part of confirming our logic and reason. If we know malware came in, we may want to try a new way to eradicate it. In certain situations, that's appropriate. In certain other situations, it's not. We have to take into account that our recoverability, how quickly we can get back operational, is also an important role. Can we do the initial forensics investigation? Okay, can we get that asset back working in production? They have to go together. They have to work hand in hand. All right, so now that we're in the recovery stage, basically we're getting back to business. Recovery is the process by reestablishing and declaring an operational status of those assets that were indisposed previously. It's important to stress that every step of the recovery process must be validated. You have to correctly perform the remediation components so that you can confirm that malware or the incident has been handled. So, with that in mind, let's look at the step-by-steps in general. Eradication has been completed. Restoring from a bare metal or to a working operating system, that might have been one of the available options. Ensuring that all OS systems, services are correctly patched and installed correctly, and that includes drivers. Restoring applications as well as the links to the application platforms back to the server. All components are operating within the normal baseline of procedures. Restoring access to all resources via the federate access controls and resources beyond the security perimeter. That way, you know that all of them have covered to a certain level. And you have a certain level of understanding that, or not so much understanding that you trust that system to a certain level that whatever was infecting the system has now been taken care of. That allows us to move on to data recovery. Data recovery, in most cases, the incident will include restoring some type of access or content to the last known good configuration. If you have a server, you're going to want to load it to a known good configuration. This requires, of course, that the organization has a routine process in place for making backups of all operational data. Again, you have some type of data backup, data recovery, whatever the case may be. You want complete copies of regularly used data. You want to understand the different types of backups, incremental or differential. Incremental is a partial copy, differential is a full copy every day. So let's say that we do a full backup every Sunday. An incremental backup would be like a backup Monday, backup Tuesday, backup Wednesday. Oh, there's a failure. Well, you'd have to recover the Sunday, Monday, then Tuesday backup. That takes up the least amount of space. A differential actually will be a full backup on Sunday, a backup on Monday, including everything that was backed up on Sunday. Backup on Tuesday would be a full backup of everything since the last full backup. So everything from Monday and everything from Tuesday. So it does require more space, but it is faster to recover. You also need to have transactional logs and system logs as part of your backup. Now the distributor is ready to start working with new transactions. Now that you have the logs back in place, now that you can start going back to normal operational status. The emergency response plan and procedure section should include things like disaster recovery, business continuity, basically how do you recover from an event. So disaster recovery plan is going to be the plan for recovery. Business continuity plan is basically a document set of procedures used to continue business operations in some form while you're getting back to operational status. We also have process strategies. So if there is an issue, how do you operate? Well, your disaster recovery plans that should have some type of processing strategy like, if we lost our primary site because of a natural disaster, we may have a secondary location site. Those secondary location sites normally come in one of three main flavors: a hot site, a warm site, a cold site. A hot site is the most expensive, but it has everything ready to go in a very short period of time. Has tables, has furniture, has computers that are set up, wires that are already connected. So basically you can restore your backup and you're operational. A warm site might have some of the equipment installed and most of it configured, but it may not have all the data. So you may have to do a full recovery of your data, but it's a little faster to get operational. It's cheaper. You have a cold site that has the equipment, has the tables, has all the wiring, but nothing's connected. Maybe the brand new computers are boxed up. The table and the furniture are all still in boxes. That way, if an issue does occur, well, you can go to your cold site, your storage area, you unbox everything, and you start setting things up for your recovery process. That's going to take a lot more time, but it is the cheaper of all of them. It might have HVAC and internet, but maybe nothing is ready to go. You also have a contract or a mutual site that you may partner with other organizations and may already have desks and computers. Well, you have to bring your own data, and the computer systems might have to be configured to your organization's structure. We also have a cloud-based site, infrastructure as a service, that might be able to allow you to work remotely while still gaining access to your data. We also have mobile sites that are usually based like an 18-wheeler that can be moved accordingly. It really just depends. All of this goes back to your disaster recovery plan. So now that you have a location to work, what's the recovery process? What is the restoration plan? How do you get transportation and personnel and power to the key pieces of equipment as part of your data recovery process? What is the backup and redundancy implementation? Are we doing backups, full backups every day? Are we doing full backups every weekend? What is the process? We've already talked about differential backups and incremental backups, but which one are we going with? Where are they being stored? Is the backup being stored at the same location as the data is housed? Is it an off-site backup? If a natural disaster comes in and takes out all your data, takes off your entire building, is the data still at that location? Or has the data been moved off-site? Is part of your backup process every day someone takes the data backups home? Is there a procedure for that? Is there a security procedure for that? All of that needs to be outlined. Is there some type of vaulting or remote journaling that is transpiring? If IT manager takes backup home, is the backup being secured at their house? Is it going into a data safe? Is it going in a fireproof data safe? How is that actually organized? Are we load balancing our transactional logs? Are we load balancing our logs? Are there hardware components to ensure that we don't lose information, such as clustering or load balancing? That way we can make sure that our information is there. Is there some type of RAID system involved? RAID being a redundant array of independent disks, where we can span data across multiple hard drives, either to gain performance or to gain some form of fault tolerance. The three main types of components when dealing with RAID is parity, mirroring, and striping. Parity allows us to rebuild data that is missing by storing parity of the data that's there on other drives. Mirroring is a technique used to mirror 100% one data set to another hard drive. So you may have two hard drives that essentially have the exact same data. That way, if a single drive dies, you have a complete duplicate copy on the other hard drive. Striping is basically the advantage of having half the data written to one drive and half the data written to another drive. This does increase performance, but if one drive dies, then you lose everything. You can do a combination of mirroring and striping, but it requires more drives. You can do mirroring, striping, and parity. Again, it just requires more drives. You do need to understand the different types of RAID. RAID 0, RAID 1, and RAID 5. There's other forms of RAID, but those are the big three. RAID 0 is striping. RAID 1 is mirroring. RAID 5 is parity. RAID 6 is additional parity with an additional drive. Those are the four, if nothing else, I would know. We also have the business continuity planning and disaster recovery testing and drilling. Your plans are only good if you actually test and verify them. So you want to have various checklists. You want to have walkthrough tests, tabletop exercises, simulation testing. That way you can test and verify your plans. How does all of this work together? You want to make sure that you understand that process. After that, we want to have some form of full verification testing, and you do this annually. That way you can see what's going on, and you can see what gaps there are, and maybe have ways to identify and address those gaps. After that, you have a certain level of understanding of recoverability. So what happens post-recoverability? Well, you have the post-recovery notification and monitoring. Back to business, proceed with caution, and you want to get the word out to senior leadership. Basically, you want to get back to a normal operational status. At this point in the incident response team, real-time sense of urgency, you can start to relax. They've met the challenge. They've been able to recover. Now it's time to take a deep breath, relax, and capture their lessons learned. That way you can adjust and figure out how to do better next time. So after the post-recovery, you can actually do your post-incident activities. So this is going to be what's happening. You want to be able to get everything out before you lose track of everything. So the process of anticipatory inquiring basically means get out as much debrief as possible. You want to start with what assumptions you had, what happened, what was good, what was bad. Get everything out. Good questions to ask: what exactly happened and when? Part of your timeline. How well did you observe each of the events? Were you able to capture information? Were you able to retain captured information? Did we have documented procedures that worked well? Did we have documented procedures that went poorly? What did we actually do? What hindered our ability to function? Was there a way to actually improve? What can leadership or management or staff do differently next time to better prepare us? How could the information sharing with the organization be improved? So these are all different activities so that you can actively look at, hey, what did I do? What did the system do? How can we improve? How can we do better collectively? And that definitely does mean looking at lessons learned. Lessons learned immediately update administrative, technical, and physical controls to include the response procedures from this event. Prompt update procedures and the content from internal and external communications after the event. Prompt development, installation, and use of new controls after the event. Update training and education after the event. And longer term, maybe add additional investment opportunities if feasible for better approaches, better equipment. Maybe your IDS didn't operate to par because we didn't have funding at the time. Well, now an event has occurred. You can normally get the funding to upgrade certain equipment to prevent the issue from happening again. You do want the ability to support ongoing acquisition of information, such as digital forensics investigation. You want to be able to work through what's happened. You also want to be able to preserve evidence when appropriate. So supporting the ongoing investigation might be developing better procedures. Understand the proceedings, both criminal and civil procedures, for discovery of digital evidence within your organization. Oh, I scrolled too many times. I apologize. All of this is important because understanding the chain of custody of evidence is critical. And when you're dealing with certification exams like the SSCP, a certain level of understanding of the process is going to need to be there. So understanding the chain of custody is going to be a part of the SSCP exam. After that, we have to look at information and evidence retention. Basically, now that we have evidence, how long are we keeping it? How long is the retention for that data, for that evidence? What are the requirements? what are the controls of requirements? So the chain of custody is one of them. So this is the sequence of each step taken and who's controlled that access from acquisition all the way through the process. You need to ensure there's no gaps, but also when you're having the information and it's in your possession, that retention, you're going to keep the records for how long. That's the retention period that is necessary to know by your organization. There are guidelines that have to be involved. A number of organizations establish guidelines during the forensics process, such as identifying evidence, collecting and acquiring evidence, examining and analyzing evidence, presentation and report finding of evidence, and then retention of said evidence, so that if it is used in court, there is at least a procedure in place that holds that data for X amount of time. Normally, it will be the same length of time that you can file a court case, normally about 7 years. But it may incur a cost, because if you have too much data being acquired, you have a storage cost now. And then you also have to have the time to figure out how long the data has been there. So you have to have a retention policy and retention procedures for figuring out when you can actually destroy what data. There's also an incident scene, and part of that in general is it's advisable to refer to a physical location of an incident and document it. So that means understanding the physical environment and the digital or virtual environment. Take photos, capture RAM, capture all of the different real-time components of a system. The first responder needs to understand the digital incident response, and they need to understand and be trained to preserve the digital incident crime scene. If evidence is contaminated, changed, or altered, it's no longer admissible during the investigation or to court. So there are processes that need to be reviewed, one of them being a forensics principle. You have to ensure that you're following your organization's procedures in retaining and acquiring data correctly to preserve it in such a manner that it could be admissible in court if necessary. Lastly, we need to have established and respected trusted members of the local area community for cybersecurity for communications of the greater community in your area. Once we have a post-event phase, we've gone through the digital forensics, we've gone through the cleanup, we may want to share information with the larger community. Hey, this is what's happened, this is how we were able to clean up. You may not want to release it to public, but you may release it to a security community. A very popular security community in most areas is the FBI's InfoGuard. That is private sector and public sector workers, normally in key infrastructure, normally related back to technology, but that was an open area for you to actually talk to peers to figure out how you can fix or what issues you had or what kill chains you've noticed or what attackers or what's the process attackers are starting to use. All of this can be shared. That way your community members can be better informed and can prevent future potential attacks. So that is all we had for this chapter. Remember that preparation is key to being able to be better prepared for an attack. If you're prepared, you can actually work through an attack. Questions or concerns, definitely feel free to reach out. Thank you. If you have any questions or concerns about anything throughout this lecture, please reach out to me. Again, part of this only really works if we have some form of back and forth. Remember, the goal here is data retention, and we do that by talking about what we've read, what we've discussed through our live lectures, and things like that. So do not hesitate to reach out if you have questions or concerns. Thank you, and I look forward to working with you throughout the rest of this video series.